18. Mr. Flanagan, you pulled this item? Breckerwoods Annex?
Yes, I have a question for staff. In the backup, it says that this property is for development of a single-family home, and I'm curious to know if that is the maximum number of units. One unit is the maximum number of units we can get. So I don't know, Alex, if this is a real estate question or a planning question or a development question, but to better understand how we're going to try and maximize the value of this property for our housing needs.
Mandy DeMayo, Neighborhood Housing and Community Development. The lot is, I believe it's 4250 square feet, and the minimum requirement for a duplex or 2 units on the site would be 5750. So it only can accommodate, within its current parameters, it only can accommodate 1 single unit. I will say that from our department's perspective, we look to maximize the number of affordable units wherever we can. It is our policy. We are in the process of putting together our land acquisition and development policy in light of the $250 million in affordable housing bonds, and included in that will be a commitment and a strategy for maximizing the number of units on any site that we, Austin Housing Finance Corporation or Neighborhood Housing Community Development owns.
So I just want to make sure I understand the limitations of this site are effectively self-imposed.
That is correct.
Or to what extent might we not be so difficult with ourselves in maximizing the housing on the site?
It is, I am familiar with the site. It is uniquely situated. It's almost like a corner. It's on a bend. And it is a small site with trees. There are limitations, development limitations, many, but we feel confident that we'll be able to fit a small, modest single-family home, which will go into our community land trust, which will subsequently be sold to income-qualified homeowner.
Well, I would ask staff in the future as you bring these items to the council that it would be, I think it's better to not predetermine in the backup what's going to get built. So even if it was just the development of affordable housing as opposed to calling out single family home, because we're about to have a very big conversation in this community about what we can and cannot build on what sites we can and can't build them on. And I would hate to have past stuff in this interim period that ties the hands of staff moving forward when we may find ourselves in a place to be more creative and innovative with our housing stock.
Mayor. So does the 5750 for 1 unit limitation exist within all zones, or if this were MF1 zoned or P zoned or something else, could we?
I believe it's all zones, but I'll let Greg Guernsey take that one.
There are smaller, Greg Guernsey, Planning and Zoning Department. We do have smaller lot sizes that you might find under different zoning categories. Might get down as low as 3,500. In some of our neighbor planning areas, you might have lots that range as small as 2,500 if those neighborhoods had opted in to certain infill housing standards that council approved. So we do have lots that are smaller in Austin than 5750.
Exactly. So what I'm asking is, if this zone, or if this lot were zoned and it's owned by us, if it were zoned otherwise, would the answer to Councilmember Flanagan's question be different?
Even if we own the lot, we usually subject ourselves to the same regulations.
I understand, but we could determine the zoning for our own lot. So what would be if Councilmember Flanagan's question is, could we get a very attractive, great duplex or 3 units on a site that we own?
Not without changing the code, because as I heard, it sounds like the lot is only 4,200 4,200 square feet, and so even a zoning change to the property, we'd still have to get to the code to get a lot size small enough that you could have 2 units, and our code doesn't provide for that today.
So what you're saying is there's no zoning classification in our current code that we could legally apply to this lot that would get us more than one.
Not without changing the code in some way.
So the answer is there's no current zoning category that we could change this to.
That's correct.
Okay, just wanted to understand that. That seems like we don't have enough tools to me.
So when, we have requirements in the code, people come and ask for variances, is there an instance where there would be a variance request?
You'd have to show hardship. I guess that would be a question for the Board of Adjustment. Usually it's not self-imposed hardship. This lot is similar configuration to other lots in the neighborhood, and but that question really has to come before the Board of Adjustment to prove a hardship, and I think it would be difficult on a vacant tract of land, even though it's small in size.
Do you know the criteria for what defines a hardship?
It's usually a configuration. It could be other property, could be topography. It could be trees that were noted. But usually those are things that you'll be probably looking at if you're trying just to fit what would normally be allowed on the property. We would normally have to allow some use of the property, and there's already provisions in our code that would allow development of a single-family home. If you're asking, could they get a variance to just remove the lot sizes to build multiple units, I would be hesitant to really speak to that without having more information on the property and probably talking with the Board of Adjustment.
Is the criteria that defines a hardship something that council created, that was a policy?
It's a combination of state law and city ordinance that deals with the Board of Adjustment. In finding those criteria, that was something that was established, I think, by the legislature in the early 80s, that you have to prove hardship. It's just not an arbitrary decision that's made by the board.
Okay.
Mayor.
Councilman Flanagan.
I feel like we're having two conversations and they're getting a little overlapping. I understand that the code that we have right now won't allow us to do all the things, I might imagine. That's why we are going to be entertaining rewriting it. So my question isn't so much about what the code allows, it's more a site conditions question. Is this site have environmental features, heritage trees we would never want to move, that kind of thing? So in a universe where we desired a duplex and the geometry of the site allowed it, notwithstanding code restrictions, right? Are we self-imposing a limitation of units because of the way the code is written? And is that the only barrier to getting that second or third unit?
I'm going to let the folks here speak to it. I'm not familiar enough with the site to answer that.
We have not done a tree survey on the site. I have a survey of the site, and just knowing the site because it's in my neighborhood, it doesn't appear that there are heritage trees on the site. The limitation from my perspective, really with just looking at the survey, would be the site configuration and the setbacks. It's a small lot.
Councilmember Flanagan, Mayor and Council, Alex Gale, Interim Officer for the Office of Real Estate. One thing that was pointed out is in the above the line, it does talk about getting affordable housing in there, and the below the line is where it speaks to the single family housing. So the above the line portion would allow for the ability to get the greatest amount. If for some reason code changes or something changes, we're not stuck to a single family housing because that's stated in the below the line item of the RCA. So we could potentially, if things change, get multiple units because it allows above the line for affordable housing, affordable residential housing.
Yeah, I understand that. That's tough for the community to understand because if it's in the backup, it feels like that's what we're voting on. And in fact, it is what we're voting on. And so to later go back and be like, well, it was above the line, below the line, I feel like that's a challenging narrative to kind of put out in the public. But just to be clear, the code, our self-imposed code, is the only restriction on the site that prevents us from exploring 2 or 3 units. Is that right?
That is my understanding.
So I read this now. What we would be adopting is authorizing negotiation and execution of all documents necessary for the development of affordable residential housing. So I think that's what we're approving. And then there's a comment that basically says that following passage of this, the Austin Housing Finance Corporation is going to move forward with a single-family home, which you would expect them to do because that's the only thing that's currently allowed. But far as, I don't think we're imposing a restriction by this adoption, because what we're adopting is the development of affordable residential housing. Only because I was thinking, what would we amend by this if we wanted to keep open that possibility, and what we would be passing just speaks to affordable residential. Do I understand that correctly?
Correct.
Okay. So I appreciate you pointing that out and that difference, but I think that for your intent, we're okay with just what it says. Councilmember Kassar.
And I think for discussion purposes, I would want the staff to know and notice some of our questions about this, because perhaps before we go and stick a shovel in the ground and put a site plan up, it might make sense for us to have a code amendment that says, why would we have a minimum lot size for our own land that we want to put affordable housing on? Because in lots of places, people are building apartments on 4,000 square feet in places that we just designated as historic up the road. Many of these folks that came and testified, we were talking about houses on 2,000 square foot lots, that we're saying that this is important historic character of Austin, but now on our own affordable housing owned land, we want to box ourselves out of that. So I think before, I would just want to know when we're getting close to sticking a shovel in the ground, so that if the council wants to entertain a code amendment at minimum to allow us to have the option on our own land that's owned by the housing corporation to not restrict ourselves from providing less or the affordable housing that we want. I think that's part of the point of this discussion. Is it sounds like there's nothing we can do today. There's no rezoning case that we can do today to provide more units here, but this is probably just one of multiple cases, right? I think we did one of these in Clarksville recently. I know there's lots in some parts of my district that we might consider purchasing, and if the only restriction is ourselves, then maybe we should lift that restriction on ourselves shortly before we miss more opportunities.
It's something we're deciding today. The motion in front of us today is whether we authorize negotiation execution for the development of affordable residential housing on this lot. Yes, Councilmember Alter.
I would like to move passage. I'm pleased that we are putting affordable housing at a site in my district. And I would also like to suggest that perhaps this is an excellent conversation for us to move to the Planning and Housing Committee so that we can explore some of the legal options that are raised by this question.
All right, it's been moved. Is there a second to that? Mr. Renteria seconds
I
that.
just want to make a quick comment that if it's possible, I know that my son has a lot that a 5-bedroom house on a 3,500 square foot lot. So I wish that whatever you built there, maximize the bedrooms so we can have a big family there.
We'd love to
Okay.
put family-friendly housing on that site.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed? Unanimous on the dais with the Mayor Pro Tem off. Thank you.
Real quick, I don't know if co-ops are considered family-friendly, but there would be an option for that as well.
Certainly considered residential housing, so that door would still be open. All right, that takes care then of item number 18.